I never thought I would see a $5 million tidal wave sweep through a five-star hotel lobby. But that is exactly what happens when you tell a specialist that physics is just a suggestion. My name is Felix, and for the last 12 years, I have been a master hydraulic engineer specializing in high-capacity oceanic ecosystems. Most people call them aquariums, but when you are dealing with 50,000 gallons of salt water suspended 30 ft above a marble floor, it is a life support system and a structural bomb rolled into one. I have spent my career learning the delicate balance of saline chemistry, water pressure, and the specific molecular bonds of German-engineered acrylic. It is a world where a single hairline scratch or a cheap valve can result in a catastrophe that makes a plumbing leak look like a spilled glass of water. The setting of my story is the world of ultra-luxury aquatic design. My company Reef Prime was founded by a man named Victor. Victor was a visionary who treated every project like a cathedral. He taught me that the water is the enemy. It wants to get out. It wants to crush everything, and it never sleeps. We were the gold standard in the industry, taking on contracts for tech giants and oil magnates who wanted a piece of the Great Barrier Reef in their living rooms. Everything was perfect until Victor started to pull back from the day-to-day operations to deal with health issues. That was when he brought in his daughter-in-law, Beatrice, as the new director of optimization. Beatrice was the kind of person who had an MBA but had never touched a wrench or felt the weight of a pressured pipe in her life. She came from the world of fast fashion retail, and she viewed our engineering firm as a bloated relic that needed to be trimmed. In her mind, there was no difference between sourcing a cotton t-shirt and sourcing a high-pressure pump for a shark tank. Beatrice didn't care about flow rates or dissolved oxygen levels. She cared about spreadsheets, lean management, and her own quarterly bonuses. From the first day she stepped into the lab, she treated me like a glorified janitor rather than the lead engineer who kept the company's reputation afloat. The specific project that became the center of our conflict was the Oceanic Spire. This was our biggest contract to date, commissioned by a woman named Lydia, who owned a chain of ultra-luxury boutique hotels. The spire was designed to be a vertical column of water, 4 stories tall, standing in the center of the lobby of Lydia's new flagship hotel in the city. It was supposed to house a delicate ecosystem of hammerhead sharks and thousands of schooling reef fish. It was a masterpiece of design, but it required a level of precision that few firms could handle. Beatrix's behavior started with small, irritating changes. She questioned why we were spending six figures on specialized acrylic panels from a specific manufacturer in Germany. She called it brand snobbery. I tried to explain that the German panels were cast in a way that eliminated internal stress points, which was vital for a vertical tank of that height. She ignored me and began looking for alternative vendors on wholesale websites. She would walk through the workshop with a clipboard marking our tools for auction, because she decided we had redundant inventory. She even tried to fire my assistant Gwen, a brilliant marine biologist, because Beatrix thought we could just use a pool guy to check the water chemistry once a week. The tension in the industry is unique because we aren't just building a product, we are managing a living environment. If Beatrice decided to save money on the lighting for a corporate office, the worst thing that would happen is a few employees would get headaches. If she decided to save money on the life support system of the Oceanic Spire, thousands of animals would die and the structural failure could literally kill people in the lobby. I spent months trying to solve these issues peacefully. I wrote memos, I brought her the math, and I showed her the safety regulations that govern high-pressure vessels. Beatrice would just smile, that thin corporate smile, and tell me that I was being an alarmist who was resistant to change. She started holding meetings where she would openly mock my obsession with safety. She called it a lack of creative flexibility. She told the rest of the crew that the old way of doing things, Victor's way, was over and that the new era of Reef Prime was about being lean and agile. To Beatrice, agile meant skipping the 48-hour pressure tests and using industrial floor adhesive instead of marine-grade epoxy. I watched her slowly dismantle the safety protocols that had kept us accident-free for 2 decades. I realized then that Beatrice wasn't just incompetent, she was dangerous. She viewed my expertise as a barrier to her efficiency, and she was determined to remove that barrier by any means necessary. The breaking point happened during the final assembly of the spire's filtration heart. I had specified a series of titanium heat exchangers because salt water is incredibly corrosive to standard metals. Beatrice canceled the order and replaced them with copper-nickel alloy units she found for a fraction of the price. When I told her the copper would eventually leach into the water and poison the sharks, she laughed and told me I was just mad that she found a better deal. She told me to make it work, or she would find someone who would. That was the day I realized that trying to be the voice of reason was only getting me ignored. If Beatrice wanted a lean, optimized disaster, I decided I was going to give her exactly what she asked for. But I was going to do it with the cold, calculated precision of an engineer who knew exactly when the glass would break. The construction phase of the Oceanic Spire began on site at Lydia's hotel, and that was when Beatrix's optimization campaign turned into a psychological war. The first incident involved what I called my flow rate Bible. It was a weather-beaten, leather-bound notebook I had kept for over a decade. It contained the specific hydraulic coefficients for every custom valve we had ever built, along with handwritten notes on how different salinity levels affected the expansion of acrylic panels under heat. It was the collective memory of my career, and in this industry, those variables of the difference between a stable tank and a catastrophic failure. Beatrice decided that physical notebooks were a security risk and a sign of an unorganized mind. During a site inspection, she walked over to my portable workstation and picked up the book. She flipped through the pages with a look of utter disgust, calling my hand-drawn diagrams childish sketches and my calculations unverified clutter. She told me that from that moment on, all engineering data had to be entered into her new cloud optimization dashboard, a software she had bought that was designed for warehouse inventory, not fluid dynamics. I tried to explain that the software didn't have the fields for the nonlinear pressure variables I was tracking. I told her that the notebook was my primary tool for real-time adjustments during the tank's initial filling. I tried to handle it peacefully. I went to her office that evening and offered to have Gwen, my assistant, spend her weekends digitizing the notes into a proper engineering CAD system if Beatrice would just return the book. I spoke calmly about the necessity of having those records on hand during the high-pressure testing phase. Beatrice didn't even look up from her laptop. She told me she had already disposed of the clutter to ensure the workspace met her new lean standard. She had thrown 12 years of my professional life into the industrial shredder. When I felt the blood drain from my face, she just smiled and said that if I were actually good at my job, I wouldn't need a security blanket made of paper. The second incident nearly resulted in a body bag. The 4-story acrylic panels for the spire weighed several tons each and were incredibly delicate. To install them, we needed a specialized hydraulic suction crane that could move with millimeter precision. I had already booked the equipment and the certified operators months in advance. A week before the installation, Beatrice canceled the contract. She told me the rental cost was extortionate and that she had found a local general construction crew that could do the job using standard steel cables and industrial pulleys. I cornered her near the scaffolding, my heart hammering against my ribs. I told her that steel cables would create point load stress on the edges of the panels, which could lead to microfractures. I explained that if a panel cracked during the lift, it would shatter like a diamond, sending tons of sharp acrylic onto the workers below. I even brought her the manufacturer's warranty, which explicitly stated that the use of non-certified lifting equipment would void the structural insurance for the entire hotel. Beatrice laughed in my face. She told me that I was a diva who was trying to protect my specialist status by making simple tasks sound complicated. She threatened to fire Gwen and the rest of my crew for insubordination if I interfered with her budget-friendly installation. I had to stand there and watch as a group of terrified, under-equipped laborers hoisted those panels with shaking cables. One panel slipped 6 in, screaming against the steel. It didn't shatter, but I saw the faint, ghostly white marks on the edge. Stress fractures that would wait until the tank was full of water to make themselves known. The final straw came when we reached the biological seeding phase. To keep hammerhead sharks alive in a closed system, you need a very specific balance of nitrifying bacteria. These cultures are expensive, sensitive to light, and require a 3W week X stabilization period. Gwen had been monitoring the levels around the clock. Beatrice saw the invoice for the next shipment of live cultures and hit the roof. She called it expensive water and told us she had found a synthetic chemical clarifier used in industrial sewage treatment that promised the same results for 5% of the cost. Gwen tried to intervene, explaining that the industrial chemical was an oxidizer that would melt the protective slime coat off the shark's skin, effectively burning them alive in their own water. I backed Gwen up, presenting Beatrix with the biological load reports and the chemical toxicity charts. I was as professional as a man can be when he's being told to commit animal cruelty for a line item discount. Beatrice didn't care about the science. She held a meeting in front of the entire hotel staff and the client's representatives where she mocked us. She told Lydia's manager that I was overcomplicating the biology to justify a bigger budget and that I was gatekeeping useless knowledge to feel important. She then personally poured the industrial clarifier into the testing vats, killing every single one of our starter cultures in minutes. She turned to me, her eyes cold and triumphant, and told me that if I said one more word about biology, I would be escorted off the site and sued for breach of contract. I realized then that I couldn't save the projects, the sharks, or the company by playing by the rules. Beatrice didn't want an engineer. She wanted a puppet. So, I decided to stop pulling the strings and let her walk right off the edge of the cliff she was building. The day of the final structural integrity certification was supposed to be the moment I reclaimed my professional standing. Instead, it was the day Beatrice decided to erase my name from the industry entirely. I arrived at the hotel site early, expecting a rigorous walkthrough with a representative from the Global Maritime Engineering Council. This was the governing body that issued master certifications for high-pressure vessels. My license was the most valuable thing I owned. It was 20 years of blood, sweat, and physics distilled into a single gold-stamped card. When I entered the staging area, I didn't see an inspector. I saw Beatrice standing next to Victor, my mentor, and the man who was like a father to me. Victor looked frail, his face pale as he leaned on a cane. Beatrice had her hand on his shoulder in a gesture that looked supportive but felt predatory. On the table between them was a thick file labeled safety violations and gross negligence. Beatrice didn't wait for me to speak. She told Victor right in front of me that I had been the one ordering the substandard parts. She claimed that she had discovered a secret ledger where I was pocketing the price difference between the German acrylic and the wholesale alternatives. She presented forged emails drafted from my internal account where I supposedly told Gwen to hide the microfractures in the panels using a temporary resin fill. It was a complete professional assassination executed with terrifying efficiency. Victor looked at me with a heartbreak so profound it felt like a physical blow to my chest. He asked me how I could betray the company's legacy for a few thousand. I tried to defend myself, but Beatrice produced a pre-written confession and a resignation letter. She told me that if I didn't sign it and walk away, she would hand the file over to the engineering council and the police. She said that my career was over either way, but if I signed, she would let me keep my pension. The moment she finished speaking, something inside me didn't just break, it crystallized. The frantic, desperate heat I had been feeling for months, the urge to explain, to save the sharks, to protect the project simply evaporated. It was replaced by a cold, absolute clarity. I looked at the oceanic spire looming 4 stories high in the center of the lobby. I saw the stress marks on the cheap copper-nickel heat exchangers. I saw the faint, ghostly white fractures in the acrylic panels that Beatrice had insisted on hoisting with steel cables. I realized then that I had been playing a game where the rules were based on honesty and engineering. Beatrice was playing a game based on optics and liability. If I tried to fight the forgery, she would use the company's resources to bury me in legal fees until I was homeless. But as an engineer, I knew something she didn't. You can lie to a mentor, you can lie to an inspector, and you can certainly lie to a spreadsheet, but you cannot lie to 50,000 gallons of salt water. I didn't argue. I didn't yell. I didn't even look at Beatrice. I looked at Victor and said that if he truly believed I was capable of this, then I had no place in his company. I picked up the pen and signed the resignation. I saw the flash of triumph in Beatrix's eyes. She thought she had won. She thought she had successfully offloaded all the structural risks onto a disgraced employee while keeping the optimized budget for her bonus. She even had the audacity to tell me that I was lucky she was being so generous. I walked over to my toolbox, the one Beatrice had tried to auction off. I pulled out a small handheld ultrasonic tester, a tool used to measure the thickness and integrity of materials. I walked to the base of the tank and made a show of checking a seam. In reality, I was checking the timing based on the current humidity and the rate at which they were planning to fill the tank for the gala. The structural failure wouldn't happen during the testing phase. It would happen during the grand opening when the lobby was full of the city's elite. Gwen approached me, tears in her eyes, asking what we were going to do. I leaned in and whispered to her, telling her to quit immediately. I told her to cite ethical concerns regarding the director of optimization in her exit interview and to make sure it was recorded by human resources. I told her to get her things and leave the city for a week. She looked at my face and I think she saw the ice there because she didn't ask questions. She just nodded and walked out. I turned back to Beatrice. My voice was calm, almost pleasant. I told her that since I was no longer an employee, I wouldn't be there for the wet run or the gala. However, as a parting gift, I told her I had already programmed the automated life support system to handle the initial pressure surge. This was a lie. What I had actually done was leave the system exactly as she had ordered it, optimized. I had removed the redundant safety overrides that she called wasteful, and I had left the cheap corrosive heat exchangers exactly where they were. Beatrice told me to get out and stay out. She called me a relic of a dying age. I walked out of that hotel lobby without looking back. I went straight to my car, drove to a local notary, and filed a formal whistleblower disclosure with the city's building department. I didn't ask them to stop the project. I knew Beatrice had already bribed the local inspectors. Instead, I filed it as a notice of non-liability for a master engineer. I documented every single one of Beatrice's orders, every canceled invoice for safety gear, and every forged signature she had used to bypass my authority. I timestamped it and sent a digital copy to a private server. I wasn't sad anymore. I wasn't even angry. I was an observer. I was going to watch the laws of hydraulics do the work that the legal system wouldn't. I was going to let Beatrice have her gala. I was going to let her stand in front of the cameras and take credit for the most efficient engineering project in the company's history. And then I was going to watch the water take it all back. The week following my resignation was spent in a state of high-functioning coldness. I didn't go home and hide. I didn't seek legal counsel to sue for my job back. Instead, I spent my time in my home workshop, surrounded by the blueprints of the Oceanic Spire and a few pieces of high-end hydraulic hardware I had conveniently forgotten to return. Beatrice thought she had removed me from the equation, but she had actually just removed the only person capable of dampening the physical reality of her decisions. I was no longer the engineer protecting the project. I was the architect of its inevitable self-correction. The trap I set was built on 3 pillars: chemistry, resonance, and a very specific legal loophole called the lead manager assumption of liability. I knew Beatrix's primary goal was the $500,000 efficiency bonus Victor had promised her if the spire was completed under budget and functional for the grand opening. To get that bonus, she had to sign a document known as a Certificate of Operational Innovation. This document essentially stated that the deviations from the original engineering plans were not just cost-cutting measures, but intentional design improvements spearheaded by the project manager. By signing it, she was legally assuming the role of the engineer of record for every modified system. Because she was so desperate for the credit and the cash, I knew she would sign it without reading the fine print that stripped her of all corporate indemnity. Next came the technical trap. I knew the copper-nickel heat exchangers she had ordered were cheap for a reason. They were susceptible to a phenomenon called galvanic corrosion when exposed to certain oxidizers. The industrial sewage clarifier she had poured into the system was a potent oxidizer. While it made the water look crystal clear for a few days, it was slowly eating away at the internal baffles of the cooling units. I didn't need to sabotage them. I just had to make sure they ran at maximum capacity. Before I left, I had accessed the building management system and set the aquarium's cooling cycle to a performance loop. In Beatrix's eyes, this looked like a good thing. It meant the water would be perfectly chilled and clear for the guests. In reality, it was pushing the corroded metal to its absolute limit, creating a chemical byproduct I called blue death, a microscopic copper sulfate residue that acts as a lubricant for acrylic seals. The final piece was the most subtle, the water hammer effect. Every large-scale aquarium has vibration dampeners to prevent the massive pumps from sending shockwaves through the glass. Beatrice had removed these dampeners to save space and $40,000. I knew that at a specific flow rate, the pumps would reach a frequency that matched the resonant frequency of the 4-story acrylic panels. It is the same principle that allows an opera singer to break a wine glass. I didn't set a timer or a bomb. I simply programmed the automated feeding system, the one thing she hadn't messed with, to activate its high-pressure cleaning jets at 900 p.m. on the night of the gala. The cleaning jets would create a momentary spike in pressure, a tiny nudge to a system that was already vibrating at its breaking point. I spent the night before the gala monitoring the hotel's public social media feeds. Beatrice was posting photos of herself in an expensive gown standing in front of the spire. The water looked beautiful. The hammerhead sharks, though likely suffering from the initial stages of copper poisoning, were still swimming. She was bragging about how she had saved millions of dollars by cutting out the unnecessary fluff of traditional engineering. She was publicly taking credit for every single one of the fatal flaws I had documented in my whistleblower report. I had Gwen help me with the final stage. Since she was no longer an employee, she spent the evening in the hotel's lounge dressed as a high-end guest. She wasn't there to sabotage anything. She was there to act as a witness and a digital recorder. She had a high-speed camera disguised as a brooch focused entirely on the base of the tank. I had told her exactly what to look for the moment the Blue Death started to seep through the primary seals. The legal beauty of this plan was that I had already filed my non-liability disclosure. By the time the gala started, the city building department had a time-stamped document stating that the project was structurally unsound and that I had been barred from correcting it. If I had simply called the police or the inspectors to stop the gala, Beatrice would have claimed I was a disgruntled ex-employee and likely would have had the inspectors paid off again. By letting the gala proceed, I was ensuring that the evidence of her negligence would be public, catastrophic, and impossible to ignore. I stayed in my apartment watching the live stream of the event on the hotel's website. The room was filled with the city's elite, the mayor, and several international investors Victor had been courting. Beatrice was on stage, a microphone in her hand, talking about the future of Reef Prime. She mentioned me by name, calling me a talented but cautious engineer who just didn't have the vision to see what could be achieved with modern optimization techniques. She pointed to the spire, which was glowing under the high-intensity LEDs, lights that were further heating the water and accelerating the chemical breakdown of the heat exchangers. I looked at my watch. It was 8:58 p.m. I knew the automated feeding cycle was about to begin. I knew the pumps were already vibrating the building's foundation due to the lack of dampeners. I knew the copper-nickel alloy was currently a porous mess. I sat back with a cup of coffee and waited for physics to do what it does best: enforce the truth. I wasn't a man looking for a payout. I was a man who had been told that his life's work was clutter, and I was about to watch the optimization of Beatrix's career turn into a $30 million lesson in fluid dynamics. At precisely 9:00 p.m., the live stream on my laptop screen showed Beatrice standing directly in front of the oceanic spire, her hand resting on the very acrylic panel I had warned her about. She was laughing, holding a glass of champagne, basking in the flashbulbs of the local press.